Summer's over, the Olympics are just a distant memory, and it's back to business as usual. And business as usual means the Eurozone crisis. Last week saw fiery protests in Greece against the latest austerity measures. In Spain, the government announced an average 12% cut in ministerial spending and a public sector pay freeze for the third year in a row. It looks increasingly likely that the EU will have to bail out many Spanish banks too. In France, the socialist president François Hollande announced the most severe budget in 30 years, with cuts of €36.9 billion, which led to large protests in France on Sunday. Yet just a few weeks ago, things had begun to look up. The European Central Bank had announced that it would effectively act as the lender of last resort for struggling countries. In Germany, the Constitutional Court approved the country's participation in an EU treaty that creates a European fund for future bailouts. Things seem to be stabilising. But already, Germany and the Netherlands seem to be backtracking on how widely the new measures will apply, creating renewed uncertainty. The head of the German central bank, the Bundesbank, suggested this year's EU finance deal was the work of the devil. If all this seems bewildering, it's worth taking a step back and trying to understand the roots of the problem. Firstly, it's important to recognise that the crisis is a product of the lack of economic growth. With every recession, there are politicians and experts who attempt to explain what has happened in a way that suggests it's a one-off, just an event that came out of the blue. In this crisis, we are told that because too much credit was given to consumers, particularly to American mortgage holders, and some governments borrowed too much, we are now in a position where there is a lot of bad debt. Apparently, running up such debt was an act of foolishness on the part of ordinary people and governments, and now we must pay for this stupidity. Now, as a bare description of what happened, it's true. As an explanation, it's meaningless. Explaining how large personal and national debts were run up in this way is like explaining that someone drinks too much because they're an alcoholic. It just restates the problem in different words. The reality is that the expansion of borrowing was a conscious decision by governments and banking authorities to avoid a recession that would have occurred about 10 years ago. But the crisis was not avoided, it was merely postponed and made worse. In fact, the current difficulties are, in many respects, the continuation of economic problems that have been rumbling on for 40 years or more. Seen in these terms, the crisis cannot be resolved until the underlying problems of profitability are addressed, economic growth revives, and the huge government debts are reduced to more manageable levels. That means economies across the world must be restructured. Individual companies or parts of companies that are not productive enough must change or close. This will be a difficult period for many people. To some extent, resolving the crisis will take time, but that process could be encouraged or hindered by government policy. Firstly, there needs to be a recognition that some debts will never be paid and must be written off. It was a mistake for relatively poor countries to borrow so much, but equally, it was foolish of banks in rich countries to lend it too. This writing off of debt has happened to some extent, but it needs to go further if people in Greece in particular are not going to experience economic depression. Secondly, there needs to be a recognition that the euro has always been a flawed idea. Attempting to have economic union without political union was bound to lead to trouble. Unravelling the euro would be an extremely messy and difficult process, but failing to recognise its flaws could mean the Eurozone will lurch from one crisis to another for many years to come. Even the EU's leaders recognise the problem, but their solution is to impose their will on everyone from the centre. When even the French are unable to determine their own economic policy, it's a sure sign that there will be an attempt to save the European project at the expense of democracy. Thirdly, there has to be a recognition that the public sector can only exist on the basis of wealth produced elsewhere in the economy. If the state is constantly drawing that wealth away, then that reduces the potential for new investment. The state could play a useful role by investing to create the conditions for new growth, but simply spending the money to give the economy a boost will only have a short-term effect. Finally, and most fundamentally, we need a clear-cut defence of economic growth itself. If we want to create the jobs to help people earn a living, and we want services like health and education, then the economy must expand and new wealth must be created. That's the only way to solve the Eurozone crisis, and it's the only way to end austerity.